Thank you so much for coming on revolution.social.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here.
We have this idea that you should go to doctors or go to your therapist or go to your parents or your school teachers or your school counselor for when you're having a mental health crisis or when you're concerned about something. Your research talks about how much adolescents and all of us use YouTube, use these social media platforms, and now use the emerging AI as a way of answering these questions, a way of figuring it out, because there's endless patience there. Mm-hmm. So much of the framing is this negative mental health thing, but your research shows that a lot of people are using it for positive mental health.
Right, yeah. So one of the papers that we did, we had youth donate their Instagram data files to us, and we analyzed their private messages or their DMs for instances where they mentioned suicide or self-harm. One finding from that is that suicide and self-harm language has become very mainstream, almost creating this desensitization effect, where, somebody will use it as a joke of like, oh, just cut me now. That might be something that we need to address with our youth, to let them know that the use of suicide and self-harm language could potentially be detrimental, and to teach them different pragmatic language that could be used to express the same feelings. The other thing we saw was that suicide and self-harm was being used as a form of sextortion, of like, oh, I'm going to kill myself if you don't share that naked picture. And those are the instances where, there needs to be a red alarm and some interventions and some ways to help these kids navigate those types of situations. But the majority of the posts that we saw were actually pretty positive and protective in that they were encouraging each other, saying like, sharing, thoughts about suicidal ideation, but then somebody saying, don't do it, I'm your friend, I'm here for you. And then the teen saying like, I can't talk to my therapist about this or my parents. They don't understand, or teens getting together to celebrate recovery, such as like, it's been a year since I've cut. And so we have to be careful when we're thinking about terms of service and content moderation, that we're not just blanket restricting these types of conversations just because they're on sensitive topics, because this might be the only lifeline that some of our youth have. The stigma around mental health is quite pervasive. And even though there's awareness campaigns out there saying call 988 and it's not, you shouldn't be ashamed if you have a mental health problem, like in practice, we all know that if you disclose any kind of mental health problems, there is still stigma around it. And so these youth are aware of that, and they're trying to seek out support in ways that they feel are safe and beneficial for them. That also gives us a moment to reflect on how can we improve our mental health support structures for youth so that they can feel safe at home to talk to their parents and to talk to their school counselors, because obviously right now that's not something that we have.
Yeah, I mean, that's so fascinating because the predominant narrative of people who want to reform things right now is this idea that we should just ban any discussion of mental health crises, ban any discussion of suicide, and try and like catch any discussion of self-harm and things like that. But your research, when you actually looked at the private DMs of adolescents on Instagram, was that they were trying to help each other.
And they were trying to fill a gap because these are topics that we have made taboo as adults. How many parents do you know have it on their list of parenting to-dos to talk to their 10-year-old about self-harm and what self-harm is, and this is what you would do if one of your friends is self-harming? These are actual things that our kids, like in elementary school, are dealing with because of exposure through the internet or otherwise. And we can't prevent all that exposure. And so we need to start thinking about, like, when do we talk to our kids about safe sexting? When do we talk to our kids about digital self-harm? When do we talk to our kids about how to gracefully say no to a request for a provocative image? Or how do we talk to our kids when they get body shamed online? And instead of grabbing our pearls and saying like, oh no, not my kid, taking a more practical approach of saying like, this is kind of our world now, and dealing with those things. And just because we ban them from social media doesn't mean that they're not going to be on it. The kids who really want to be on there, they're going to get burner phones. They're going to use VPNs to spoof their IP if they're in states with bans. They're going to go to the dark web, and these places are arguably even more dangerous than the mainstream ways to access social media. And so we just need to be careful that we're just not pushing kids to doing even more dangerous things.
Absolutely. That's so important. There's this effort to do age verification and ID verification. There's the Online Services Act in the UK, which is trying to protect minors from porn. There's the soon to be implemented Australian law to ban minors, anyone under 16 from YouTube and Discord and all of the major social media apps. And there's a proposal here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to do something similar. And in each of these cases, you're like, are we really actually stopping the kids from using this, or are we putting them in a more precarious place? Does banning kids from drinking alcohol actually stop them from drinking alcohol, or does it mean that they're hiding it? Mm-hmm. And do the platforms, when they can say, well, we have no one under 16 on our platform, do they then absolve themselves of the responsibility of this? Because their algorithms, of course, can continue to target ads at these kids. They continue to make money of them. But now they can say, oh, well, this person who's acting like a kid clearly has an adult ID. Someone gave an adult ID, or somehow they verified themselves, or they're using a VPN. The bans end up pushing people into a more precarious position.
Right. And that's one of the things that we need to be careful of is we're removing the culpability of the social media platforms, knowing that there are youth on their platforms. Like, for instance, there was an article posted today in the last week or so from, I believe it was OpenAI. They said, well, now that we have stronger age verification within our platform to safeguard youth, now we're open to just being able to integrate erotica. So the platforms are using this idea of like, well, now we can deliver even like more adult interactions and experiences. But then again, it's like, are you really ensuring that there aren't youth on the platform? And even outside of the platform, like for instance, apps that serve ads, or the ads that come up on YouTube, like those I've noticed myself have gotten even more inappropriate with some of these bans for youth. I almost want to propose the opposite, is like I would love there to be spaces, digital spaces online that have reverse age verification, meaning that they are kids only spaces with some like trusted adults and moderators where adults can't be. My daughter wanted to reinvent Club Penguin because she just thought that was like a great idea. But the thing is, we're taking away all of these spaces where youth can interact when we're not looking at how safe it is anymore to play in the streets of the neighborhood. Because if we're taking away the physical spaces where kids can be and play and socialize safely, and then also taking away the digital spaces, we're not really leaving them with much alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, there's this paradox where we have been worried about the physical spaces that kids might go into and go out in the world, and so we take that away. And with the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns, that did it too, and it drives them into this online space. But then where do they get the playground? My now teenager we lived in Portland, Oregon at the time, and they would go out and walk the dog. And mm-hmm. 3 different times when they stopped an adult for asking for directions to just walk home. This is a very safe suburban Portland, Oregon neighborhood. And 3 different times, instead of giving this kid directions, which the adult knew about, they actually called the cops and had the cops come and take my kid home. And I was trying to say, we had ideas. They had a phone, they had the space, everything else. They were just, talking to what looked like a trustworthy adult. And we're now saying you can't trust those people and everything else. And so we drive kids in order to protect them online. And now we pull them off of things. And, there's the ironies of these protections in the UK with the Online Services Act. Kids are allowed to be live streamers. They can go on Twitch and do a live stream. But now only adults can comment on their stream. Because we're protecting kids. So in order to protect kids, you stop other minors from being able to comment. And so now we have 15 and 16-year-olds who have the right to stream because that's a free speech right. But they don't have the right to talk to their peers. And so is that protecting kids by saying, okay, now we're going to have a 15-year-old do live streaming and only adults can watch them?
Right. Yeah. That seems a little a lack of equivalence there. And I think that's just one of the examples of what we're doing in this space is very much driven by fear instead of doing things that make sense and that are practical, because we all want to do something and we all know there is a problem. But trying to figure out how to solve that problem, nobody has agreed on. And it's the sound bites that get the most attention. And we need to be careful of that because if we keep following the sound bites, we're going to have this moral panic where we're just going to cut teens off from everything until they're adults, and it's going to restrict their opportunities and their ability to learn, and it's going to disproportionately harm those who might not have those resources at home and who may need more support, like autistic youth or LGBTQ plus youth, those that need stronger and larger support networks that are more diverse.
So this gets into another thing that I think is fascinating is one solution people propose for this is saying, well, you have to use your real names. And let's just verify everybody's IDs, verify everybody's age, hand over a driver's license and ID. And your research talks about anonymity and how it is actually an important aspect of something that adolescents need the ability to be anonymous in order to protect their own safety. I wonder if you could talk about the utility of anonymity and how it differs
from
what you found in your research versus conventional wisdom.
I'm not a lawyer, but there are some folks in the U.S. who argue that our right to be anonymous is part of our right to free speech. And to some extent, I think that there's truth in that. And I've also been part of support communities for stigmatized populations. You don't want to be somebody who has to use your real name if you are a victim of child abuse or if you are somebody who's been diagnosed with a chronic STD. You want to be able to seek support and advice without using your real name. That also goes along with the whole idea of the right to forget. One of the reasons we argue that we should keep youth offline is because something you say now will be on the internet forever, and therefore it might affect your job opportunities, 30 years from now. Well, that kind of negates the idea of like always having to use our real names for every service. But there's also like levels of anonymity and like digital personhood that we can work on. Like for instance, there are services that could be used to just verify age or just verify like that you were a school child or that you're a part of the affiliation of this group, and doing it in a decentralized way that preserves privacy but gives some level of verification based on certain attributes might be one way to do that. That was something that we looked at on a DARPA ISAT study group, not using this as like a digital ID, but like being able to verify certain aspects of one's identity in the context that it might be needed.
Yeah, and it's still quite tricky because, we have this case of Discord and others who were using these verification services, or the T app, which was an app that had a big data leak earlier this year, where this was for women who wanted to report potential sexual predators or men who were behaving poorly when they were considering dating them. And they promised that they would delete these IDs. They promised they would do the right thing. And it turns out that they didn't do good data hygiene, and all of the ideas of all these women leaked. And then there was a huge backlash, and a huge bunch of them received stalkers and other things like that through the verification. So it's quite tricky. Once you collect the data, even if it's not public, it's very hard for platforms to keep it private and not leaking.
Right. And so being able to keep some information anonymous to be able to seek the right resources is something that our youth might need to do with or without parental consent in some cases, depending on the situation. I was a victim of child abuse when I was between the ages of 10 and 14. That's why I view the internet as this double-edged sword, because like I was a Gen Xer, so we didn't have internet, and we were 7 miles down a dirt road in Mississippi. So I couldn't look up ways to report my abuser or what that even would mean. A double-edged sword mean that the internet could have been my saving grace of years of abuse but at the same time, after I got out of that situation, I was one of the first teens on AOL Instant Messenger talking to strangers online and seeking support, love, and approval. And sent my address to some random guy who I later found out killed somebody. So, like, we have to realize that, like, there are benefits and risks to the internet. And oftentimes the internet just amplifies the risks that are already happening in real life. So we can't use it as, like, a scapegoat.
Those risks and those harms are very real, but in your case, or in the case of many people who grew up before widespread internet access, they were invisible. Like no one knew beyond your immediate family potentially or yourself that these abuses were going on because you had no access to communicate to a larger world. And so much of what we see is the moment someone does get access to it, they use it as a lifeline.
Well, we wrote one paper on children in need of services who self-identified as, children of incarcerated parents or of domestic violence. And we looked at their support-seeking posts and that they were a network helping one another. But then the flip side of that we realized is like, I could be a predator on this website and easily find and target these youth who I know are vulnerable and who don't have parental oversight. And so the one good thing about that platform, it was a pseudo-anonymous named platform, and so it wasn't real name. So again, being able to be on the internet without tying your name to everything sometimes is a protective factor as well.
One theme I see in all of your research is this idea of a sort of an approach to interacting with social media, approach to meeting the needs of adolescents as they get online, as they use mobile phones, as they use social media, that's driven into freedom and collaboration as opposed to control. That says that it's giving kids freedom to explore, to make mistakes, to do things. And that, limits to these screen times and things like that doesn't address the root causes. So I wonder if you could talk about this framing of how do we cultivate a space for people to have freedom to explore as opposed to, this is just a scary thing and we need to lock our kids away.
One of the ways that has really opened my eyes is through our program called Teenovate, where we're working directly with teens as co-researchers and co-designers to come up with solutions that they think would be more empowering to protect them online. We had a paper called Strike at the Root that really touched on this idea of like, teens don't want to be treated like victims online and restricted because other bad actors are doing things that they shouldn't do. Instead, they would like there to be practices and norms that enforce good digital citizenship online. And for those practices of digital citizenship to be enforced for everybody, not just for them because they're vulnerable or at risk. We have local norms, like when we're in person, if you're at the mall, you don't take off your shirt. There's like public decency type of situations, but we don't necessarily have that on the internet, especially in the US because of freedom of speech. And so thinking about it through design principles of like, how can we not be enforcers of good behaviors, but how can we facilitate more positive behaviors through community-based oversight in a way that's not gamed or used in malicious ways? And so some of the solutions that teens suggested were ways that, like if individuals could flag somebody that they think is, an unsafe person, and if there were enough people who independently reported them that were not connected, for there to be means of actually like investigating and finding out if that person is a predator. Because they were expressing frustration in the current mechanisms of blocking and reporting, because they said it just doesn't work. And then the platforms will get back to us and say, oh, it didn't violate our terms of service, we're not going to do anything. And so it's like they're trying to self-regulate and to create boundaries and make a healthy space for themselves, but they're struggling to do so. And so in some ways, it's not a matter of like, oh, well, we need to censor or use moderation. Like, what if we gave them a filter where they could curate their own content that they want to see? That's not the same thing as censorship. That's self-empowerment of like, I don't want to see the murder of somebody from the recent news because that's traumatizing and triggering to me. And like, we all should be able to have the ability and the mechanisms on social media to curate our own experience like that.